All right, welcome to the latest episode of Out of Left Field, where we talk about current events and politics from a left-wing and socialist perspective. We've now got an RSS feed, a website, a Facebook group, and we're on SoundCloud. Today's episode is a kind of merged two-parter, the BC election, which happened recently, and the most recent NDP debate in Victoria, which happened recently.
And we were there to actually view it in person.
Yeah, for both. You even went down to the legislature for ice cream, didn't you?
I did go down to the legislature to meet John Horgan and have ice cream when they were inaugurated. It was actually pretty cool. It was like living history in the making. You know, seriously. We've had a liberal government in BC for 16 years, and this is a true change of power. You know, this is a whole different political thing going on. So it was history in the making. It was cool.
Sure. I guess when I think of history in the making, I don't usually think of free ice cream. But
and yet here we are. Yeah. What a time to be alive, Mac.
Indeed, what a time to be alive.
So we're gonna start off with the recap of the Victoria debate last week. We had unfortunately Charlie Angus was not able to attend the debate. Just to bring everybody up to speed, there is a leadership race within the New Democratic Party of Canada as to who will be the next leader, and we have Jagmeet Singh, Nikki Ashton, Charlie Angus, and Guy Caron vouching to be the leader. And I want to actually just take this opportunity to apologize. During our last podcast on the subject, I pronounced Jagmeet's name wrong over and over again. I said Jarmeet instead of Jagmeet. So just a heads up, I'm aware of that. I'm sorry, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce his name right to the best of my ability this time around.
I keep saying Guy Caron.
Yeah, because you fucking Anglophone.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't speak both official languages.
Yes, so am I. I say that like it's a slur, but I don't speak a word of fucking French myself. So, glass houses, right?
Yeah, anyway,
his name is Guy. Okay, can we just say his Guy, Jagmeet, Nikki, and Charlie.
There. Or Charles.
Fuck off. Okay, God damn it, can we just get on the same page
anyway.
here? Okay, so the debate in Victoria, I was really excited. I had never seen a live debate of that caliber, in a live setting of an actual leadership campaign, and to be honest, I was disappointed. It was the most boring debate since the very first one that was had. The candidates didn't really differentiate themselves very much. There weren't a lot of specifics. I thought the CBC wrote a really apt on-point article about this, where they said, all three candidates put forward some really good ideas, but they didn't really say any specifics. So I don't know if a debate, a live debate like that, is really the best kind of context to hash out specifics and policy things. But I thought the CBC was correct. Jagmeet, for example, laid out he said we need a national housing strategy, but there wasn't really much room to discuss what a national housing strategy actually was. We have Guy Caron talking about universal basic income a lot, but there's not a lot of opportunity to really hash out exactly what kind of basic income that is, what that means specifically. Nikki Ashton was able to bring up her racial justice platform, which has a lot of really good stuff in it, but there wasn't a lot of time to discuss exactly what that was, what that means. So it overall kind of felt like a kind of wishy-washy debate where not a lot was really said,
I think, given that there's only going to be a few more weeks for sign-ups and all that sort of stuff, and so that this is essentially this was the last debate before the cutoff,
August 17th. Yeah, if you're not a member before then, you can't vote in the leadership race.
Yeah.
So everyone listening to this, sign up, please.
Yeah, if you want to.
I've actually heard of people from right-wing groups are posing the idea of signing up to vote for Nikki Ashton because they think that she's such a insane, crazy left-wing SJW feminazi that she will sink the party into the ground, etc.
Well, we'll lose federal elections.
Yeah, like
What?
that hasn't happened already.
Anyway, no, So, but what I'm thinking is like, okay, so all the candidates have.
Before you continue, for the record, I support Nikki Ashton. I don't think she's an SJW feminazi, and I think those terms are stupid.
Well, I'll tell you what,
childish.
I think she is an SJW feminazi, and that's exactly why I support her.
And on that
for
basis,
leadership of the party of the NDP. Yes.
Okay, so go on. What were you saying?
Anyway, so I think the reason why this particular debate was really boring was twofold. One was that Charlie Angus wasn't there. And
that was a noticeable absence.
He is by far the most entertaining debater, like, person who can throw out those lines that are funny and kind of interesting.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, he is... He always uses these folksy anecdotes, and I find it kind of a little bit tiring, but it's at least interesting to listen to.
And he's a lot more self-effacing than the other candidates are.
He's funny, like he'll make, when asked about marijuana or whatever, he's like, yeah, I was in a band. He'll just make jokes like that.
Yeah.
And he's good. Like, I like the guy. I'm not sure if, I would say, as an NDP supporter, he's kind of number 2 on my list as far as out of the 4 running. I don't think that he has really flushed out policy very well so far. He's kind of like vague, and I think personally he kind of represents like the old guard of the party. But I like him. If he won the leadership, I wouldn't be upset about it.
I'd be happy with that, actually. But the other thing I think was that because it's the last debate before the voting cutoff, I don't think anybody was really all that keen on presenting anything they didn't know would be just sort of a simple, straightforward win for them.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of like anyone really saying anything particularly outlandish or weird, which was in many cases the case with the other debates, where sometimes they seem to be sort of testing whether or not certain phrases or programs or policies would really get any hold, and sort of adjusting their positions as they went on. At this point, I think they all kind of have a clear understanding of, where their campaigns are and what they're basically fighting for as candidates. And because of that, there wasn't really a lot of debate going on in a literal sense. It was more of just like, here's a statement I believe in, and then other people would try to ask sort of qualifying questions about like, well, yeah, but I don't really understand how this could work. And then they'd give an answer like, well, actually, it does work perfectly because it's my position. And then they just kind of leave it at that. And whether or not you were compelled or convinced by any of that is, I think, a relatively small number of people at this point compared to where it was, say, a few months ago.
I did notice that in Jagmeet's opening statement, he borrowed a few pieces of Nikki Ashton's platform, including universal pharmacare, universal dental care, and free post-secondary education.
Yeah.
I mean, he hasn't actually added those to his website as part of his official platform, so it kind of felt like he was just saying stuff that he thought people would like to hear.
Maybe. I also think there was, and this is probably the only thing that happened in the last debate that was really, I think, substantial, was, and this also, well, it started in the debate before this one that was in Regina, I think, was where he was asked by Charlie, actually, who wasn't there this time, about the idea of universality in programs, and particularly with the OAS. And Guy Caron went after him for that again in this debate. And it seemed like that opening statement was sort of something of a hedging of like, well, the fact that you are now being associated with means testing, you need to move away from means testing. The easiest way to do that is to declare your support for these universal programs. So just do that. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was the advice he got from his campaign team. The problem, though, I guess, is that he was still getting criticized, vaguely hit with a feather over the lack of universality in his program. And I think Guy Caron actually put forward a really decent defense of, like, universality is a fundamental principle of social democracy in the last debate. That it's not just, like he said something like, it doesn't matter if rich people get it too. The point is that this is a birthright, that you get it. If you're a Canadian, these services are for you to access, and it doesn't really matter why.
As a Canadian.
Yeah, we are better off with services that function in that manner. Jagmeet's proposal for what to do with the OAS and merging all these different programs together, turning sub-programs that aren't means-tested into means-tested programs by merging them into the OAS, which is itself means-tested, all of that I mean, it's all very vague and confusing to me, but what it says is that he doesn't seem to care quite as much about that principle of universality, because his criticism when he was asked in the debate previous, the criticism he threw back at Charlie Angus was basically that, we don't want rich people getting more money. We don't want to be handing out money to rich people. And it's like, well, no, we don't, but that's not the point. If you're a Canadian citizen, that's the question.
Right.
Not, are you rich or not?
So just so we all are on the same page here, means tested is what?
Universality is basically like...
Well, no, I know universality, but what
sure,
is
but
means tested?
I just want to be clear here. Universality means everybody gets the same either access to the program or money from the program. Right. Everyone.
Yeah.
So in the case of healthcare is universal.
Yeah.
Because you go to the hospital and you get access to it.
You get free.
It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets the same amount of healthcare service, but it means everyone gets the same access through the program that exists.
Right.
Means tested means that based upon your circumstances, you may or may not have access. So for instance, if you were to go to the hospital and they were to go, actually, you made $60,000 last year, so you got to pay. That would be a means-tested healthcare system.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And in the case of OAS, Old Age Security, what he's basically proposing is...
He is who?
Jagmeet is basically proposing is that certain people will get old age security on the basis of the amount of money they have.
Right.
Now, Charlie Angus's criticism of it, and I think it's a fairly valid one, is a lot of these pensioners are sitting on property, which is now worth a lot of money, but it's just the house that they own. And unfortunately for them, a lot of them are currently being excluded from certain services, programs that are means tested because their assets basically price them out of it.
Outweigh them, yeah.
So they're being faced with the question, do you sell the house you live in just so you can get these programs so you can pay the bills and pay for medicine? Or do you keep your house and just don't get this money that you probably need because, you're retired and all that sort of stuff? And the additional problem with means testing is that it is a principle of social democracy that the whole fucking point of social democracy is everybody gets what's being provided.
Yeah.
Everyone. Nobody's excluded. It doesn't really matter why.
Well, I mean, come to think of it, when you apply the logic of means tested to the healthcare system, it all of a sudden seems to look like private healthcare, or it has some of the same features of private healthcare, where you have to pay because of XYZ reasons, and that's bullshit. Healthcare is a human right, and yeah, I mean, if we're going to consider old age security or whatever other social program as a human right,
education,
or a right of all Canadians, then yeah. Although on the surface of it, it might not make sense to be giving the same service to the rich people in the country because they can already afford it. When you do look deeper into it, yeah, it doesn't really make sense. If we're talking about social rights and what human beings deserve on a fundamental level, then no, it shouldn't be means tested. Everybody should get it, And I think that this leads itself into a discussion on Caron's universal basic income platform, because I mean that if we're talking about means tested, what is a social right, what is your right as a Canadian, then Caron's position on universal basic income really opens up that debate a lot, and I think that I just want to say that before we begin this discussion on UBI, I think that UBI is there's a lot of people that are really in favor of it.
What did you say earlier? If you like UBI, you really, really, really like UBI?
Yeah, it's almost culty in that way.
Yeah,
and I don't think that UBI is a bad idea. It's on the principle of it, I think it's good, making sure that everyone is at a basic level of subsistence or a standard of living, and it ensures that no matter who you are, you have some level of income to have a place to live, to sleep at night, to buy food. On principle, I support it, but it gets really granular, and I think that Nikki Ashton's criticism of UBI is that, we have people in the Liberal and Conservative parties that are in support of this, and that's kind of a red flag, especially when you talk about the cost savings of UBI, that if we have UBI, then we can get rid of all these other fucking social programs that are just costing taxpayers money, right? And to me, when I hear that, I hear UBI is a form of austerity. Like we can cut social programs, we can cut the social safety net because you have minimum income. So then, everything else can just fuck off, right? Yep. I do support Nikki Ashton's position that, UBI is something that we can consider and it can supplement the existing social safety net, but it should not be a reason to cut social programs, and it shouldn't be a reason to get rid of existing, social rights in the Canadian social safety net, and that if we're talking about the savings of it, any cuts to social programs should be a red flag for anybody within the NDP,
I think the problem with UBI is that it's not one thing. It's not like it's a singular program that is being proposed. It's a variety of different ways of either topping up services or sending out paychecks or just, making sure people don't die from starvation. There's a lot of different ways that it's being proposed, a lot of different ways that it may be applied. The problem I guess I have with it is ultimately that, well, for instance, if UBI was to be used to pay people money if they say we're under the poverty line, what is the difference between that and subsidizing private businesses? Because if, say, someone works at McDonald's and they don't make enough money to survive in the city they live in and UBI just pays the rest, well, shouldn't McDonald's be paying that money to the employee that is actually working there? Like, this sort of gets into the question of a living wage being I think, a much better answer to the problems of the world today.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, with proposing a living wage, as well as very nice to propose, it's way more difficult to actually achieve, whereas at UBI, depending on how it's presented, can be as easy as just another government program that may in fact save money. And so you sort of do away with all of the political consequences of trying to help people by making it, revenue neutral or whatever.
And that brings up the question about, like, a living wage in Victoria or Vancouver is going to be way higher than a living wage anywhere else in the province of British Columbia, right?
Yeah.
And so if we're talking about a universal basic income, the same thing. It's going to be way higher in the major urban centers. And that begs the question of what is considered to be a income for people that they can live on. Because if you're going to set it to the rates of Victoria or Vancouver, you're going to have a whole bunch of people living in the interior of British Columbia that are going to have like way more money than they actually may need for a living wage, right?
Well,
and I'm not going to argue against putting money into the pockets of working class people.
The interior doesn't need this money.
Well, I mean,
I get what you mean.
If we talk about a living wage, like let's say that the principle of a minimum wage is to be something that people can live on. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be for Victoria or Vancouver. That's going into like the $21 an hour territory.
It's around $19-20.
And the main enemy here is of housing costs. The housing market is out of control in Vancouver, Victoria, Toronto. Major metropolitan centers. Even from the perspective of a business owner, say you set up shop 5 years ago. And you're paying your employees this much, your labor costs are this much, my rent is this much. All of a sudden, the goalposts are moved further away because of the housing market. Your employees need more money because they can't afford a place to live, they can't find a good place to rent. With all of these variables, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's hard to even determine what would be a fair amount to set as a standard of what is a universal basic income going to pay people with so many regional differences in terms of what people are paying just for basic housing costs.
Yeah, the major reason why I don't support Guy Caron is that I don't like his UBI plan. And seeing as that's the bulk of his reason for running,
his flagship program.
Yeah, his flagship program. It really does put a real a stopper on all the other things that I think he's really good at. Like all of his other policies, I think have been pretty solid. The problem I guess I have with his UBI is that I don't think it doesn't appear to be universal the way he's described it. It's going to top up existing programs, which sounds like a bureaucratic mess to me. I mean, it's one thing to say we're going to mail, every Canadian $800 every month. That's simple and straightforward and quote-unquote universal. Whether or not you need the money, we're mailing it out there, and if you just want to burn that check or you want to spend it on booze or whatever, we don't care. You get this money. We need to keep the economy moving. We need to keep people doing people things.
Right.
Because there's not enough work, which is itself kind of absurd. But whatever. Let's pretend that that's the reality for a minute. The problem is, I guess, is that universal basic income doesn't really, it's not really that kind of thing. It's just another social service that you have to apply for, that there's, conditions for, and you may or may not receive that money based upon circumstances essentially out of your control. If a universal basic income, and I mean, we're harping on this a lot, but it is one of the four candidates' basically one and only policy proposals. Like it's the
he has a good policy on workers' rights. And,
he does. But I mean, even he has said several times this is his reason for running. Really, he wants to see universal basic income implemented in Canada, and that's it. Like that is first and foremost. Every question he's been asked about other things, it's always, we could do that, and in fact, maybe I support that, but universal basic income first.
Yeah, like free tuition. When
free tuition's a good idea, but let's do universal basic income first.
Yeah.
I guess, having looked at it, I just don't see it as a kind of a universal in a way that makes sense to me, like healthcare is universal, or education. Additionally, I don't see universal basic income in and of itself as a solution for the problems we're facing in the economy today.
It does feel like a Band-Aid, like we have these structural problems in the economy, and we can just fix it with a UBI Band-Aid.
It's like saying, for some reason, people don't have enough money, so let's just give them money.
Yeah.
Instead of asking, why don't people have enough money? Why aren't people making enough in their pay? Their paycheck is so low. Why can't people afford the rent? Those are big, complicated questions and have big, complicated, in some cases, they don't really have clear answers, but whatever. Those are, I think, the real issues. And the problem, I guess, with the UBI is that, A, it doesn't address those issues. But in not addressing them, I can't imagine it will be setting itself up for anything but failure. If a UBI is implemented, I mean, won't that just cause inflation to go up? And then the UBI will either have to increase in cost or it becomes less useful. Without some sort of mechanism for ensuring that it, keeps pace with inflation, and God knows how much it'll cost at that point, it seems like UBI will just push us towards further and further, inflation of costs. Like if every person in Victoria was given an extra $100 or $800 a month, I can't imagine anything but that in another year or two, rent will be $800 more.
Right.
Like that money will just be clawed back through the things people are having to pay for anyway. So I guess we talked quite a bit about Guy Caron's UBI policy.
Yep.
The other thing he mentioned, which I love the sound of, and I've read a little bit of afterwards, was his idea of the workers' trade policy, or trade agreements that are based around workers' rights. Because, the usual dichotomy is between free trade and fair trade. Right. And I like the idea of fair trade. I like the word fair. It sounds very fair. But very rarely have I ever heard it really described in a way that goes beyond simply saying what's fair, right? Let's just have fair trade instead of free trade. It's like, well, okay, but it doesn't really mean anything. But in the case of Guy Caron and his policy, it seems to have given it a bit of a specific weight to it. His workers' trade policy essentially suggests that we make trade agreements on the basis that improves the conditions of the working class in the countries that we trade in.
That sounds fucking awesome.
Yes, and it has to be both us and them, right? So if we make a trade agreement with a country, the question is that a country that respects workers' rights, allows for unions, is comparable to us in its, the level of rights workers have? And if not, then either the answer is no, or the increase of those rights is a prerequisite to our agreement to that trade deal.
Yeah, I think this is a fucking great idea, but what countries could we then sign trade agreements with? I mean... Well,
very few, as it turns out. And of course, the problem is, what about the trade agreements that are already signed? I mean, we have trade agreements with most countries on Earth now, one way or another. They're not all free, but, what do we do when it comes to selling stuff to Saudi Arabia, for instance, which has just been in the news
that's
lately?
A good question, but I'm thinking, like, if we're talking about, we have a trade deal, a potential trade deal with China right now for a free trade agreement, and people are talking about, they don't respect human rights and they have all these problems, and that's true, but Canada is not exactly like a major player on the world stage. And so at this point in history, I feel like we're kind of stuck between, do we continue to align towards the United States, or do we realign towards China? And neither one of them has a particularly good reputation on human rights or labor rights. So,
well, I mean America's is slightly better, but also
2 words, Mac: Guantanamo Bay.
I thought you were going to say Donald Trump.
Oh well, there's a lot of 2-word combinations you could use.
The Deep South. No, sure, I get that. But I mean, to be fair to America, and this is one of the few times you can be fair to them.
Go on.
Their labor rights are much better than the labor rights in China.
That says a lot about both countries' labor rights.
It does. It says a lot, and it says a lot that we have to go that far afield into a country where labor rights often include just nothing. In some parts of the country, unions are basically run out of town. And I won't tell you which country I'm talking about, but my point is that in the case of China, the actual enforcement of anti-union laws are much more strict and much more violent than in the United States. However, the working class in China is a lot more well-organized than in the United States. So there is some nuance there, sure. But I guess when it comes to these trade agreements, or this idea of like workers-first agreements, I think we could make the case that be the policy. Like, we can say that, independent unions. Does this country have independent unions or not? And if they do, then we can continue negotiating trade with them. And that seems like a fairly simple thing, but it would actually exclude a whole bunch of countries from trading with Canada.
That's true.
And yeah, maybe we're a small fish in a big pond, but so what? The big fish need the small fish to trade with. Like, this is still both sides need something out of this. So I don't know how successful it would be in kind of a global economic trade system, but I think at the very least it would provide a sound starting point for ourselves and other countries to sort of start moving in a better direction.
I think so too. I mean, if we're talking about setting a good precedent to follow, then we should at least set an example for the rest of the world to follow.
Well, that's what we always like to pride ourselves on, thinking that we kind of sometimes do. We like to be the country people follow, even if no one actually cares about us.
I think the only other thing to mention here regarding the NDP debate is Nikki Ashton's recent policy announcement on racial justice. It has all sorts of stuff in it, and not all of it is necessarily related to racial issues. We have the repeal of Bill C-51. We have the end to the Safe Third Country Agreement. We have, and what I like most about this is that it would grant citizenship to all temporary foreign workers.
That's a big thing for me. I mean, Christ, my position has generally been, if you're good enough to work here, you're good enough to be a citizen.
Yeah,
period.
I mean, that's
full stop.
That's the whole thing.
There's no we can debate culture and history and all that sort of stuff all we want, and how much people understand or care about Canadiana, essentially. But I would argue that plenty of Canadians don't care about Canadiana. So, who was the major general in the War of 1812? Well, it was Isaac Brock. Now, I know that because I love history and I'm a history wonk. But I don't expect that to be some kind of gatekeeping secret question that, either you know that answer or you go back to a miserable life in some other country.
I guarantee you that more immigrant applicants would know the answer to that question than most people that live in Canada and were born and raised here.
But I don't care one way or the other. I guess the idea of bringing people in like that and saying, if you're already working here, that's fantastic, and you should be able to stay for 2 reasons. 1, because I think that's just the fucking humane thing to do. And 2, it makes it way easier to undercut a lot of the racist arguments about people stealing jobs or undercutting unions or good wages. Because if we're all on the same level, if we all apply under the same rules, then there is no benefit. I mean, rapidly it would turn out there is no benefit to bringing in foreign workers, because they're essentially would be immediately made into Canadian citizens. So what's the point?
Yeah. No, I agree fully. And in fact, I think that the temporary foreign worker program is one of the most abused things in the Canadian economy.
Well, sure. They fucking have people working at Tim Hortons and all the rest of it. Like
Tim Hortons loves the temporary foreign worker program. In fact, there was a really good Beaverton article written about this exact thing where they concluded it with the employees at Tim Hortons love Canada so much that they can't wait to become citizens themselves. So I really like Nikki Ashton's racial justice platform. I think all of her policy announcements have been really, really good, full of details. I think that Guy Caron, he's kind of like a one-issue candidate in terms of his UBI, although I really do like his really like his Workers First trade deal platform. I think it's a really good precedent to set. And as far as Jagmeet Singh is concerned, I kind of think so far that he's kind of liberal that just wants to say whatever he needs to say to get elected.
I don't even know if he's a liberal. I mean, look, he's an NDPer, and he's a pretty solid one. Let's face it, Jagmeet Singh is more left-wing than any of the candidates that were running in the last leadership race. So I don't think
based on what he says.
Well, based on what he says, sure. But that's
I get the feeling from him that he just kind of wants to say what people want to hear.
Sure.
So I don't necessarily take him at his word.
That may be the case, but I guess what I'd be getting at is, why? Why is it that, 5 years ago, I guess now, we had a leadership race that was dominated by fairly right-wing characters in the party. Brian Topp and Thomas Mulcair were the big names running then, and Nikki Ashton was also ran protest vote at that point.
She lost in the first ballot.
Yeah. Now we're looking at a race that's seems like kind of a dead heat for the most part. There's no clear front runner. I've seen polls saying everyone's the leader. I've seen polls saying everyone's in last place. I've no idea what the hell's going on. But the fact that if you were to ask who's the right winger in this race, I mean, everyone has their own opinions, but I would say it's Jagmeet, not so much because of his policies, but because of his support from the party apparatus.
Right.
That the same sort of people that supported Tom Mulcair are supporting him now, Jagmeet now. And because of that, I assume and believe that he will represent the sort of status quo right wing of the party that doesn't really want to change. And yet, his policies, his statements, are tacking hard to the left in order to just get a hearing in this race. I think that's interesting because what it says is that the leadership of the party is deathly afraid that if they don't kowtow to the party membership's left wing, and so they don't come up with a lot of left wing rhetoric, they'll lose outright. And I think they're right in that fear. But if we're not going to have a leader that is actually left-wing, like Nikki Ashton or Guy Caron, I am perfectly happy to have a leader that is at least afraid of the membership, like Jagmeet Singh seems to be.
I think it's about time that we had a leader of the party that was actually afraid of the membership.
Well, that's one of two things is going to happen at the end of this race. We're going to get someone who had to push hard to the left just to win, or we're going to get someone who was a hard left-winger who won.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that Charlie Angus or Guy Caron are hard left.
Well, the workers' program, Charlie Angus's desire to completely upset the apparatus of the party, to make it essentially like an activist party again. Yeah, sure, these things don't really fall into the left-wing, right-wing dichotomy, but I guess what I'm saying is all of the candidates are presenting their most radical policies that they can at least agree with, even if only in principle. And it's very fascinating to me that that's the kind of campaign we're looking at right now. There is no right-wing candidate in this election, essentially.
Dude, Jagmeet is the right-wing candidate.
Fine, but he's also been the candidate who said in the last debate that he is in favor of free education and pharmacare and anything else. That's what fascinates me about this.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
How, under other circumstances, under normal circumstances, you would have three kinds of candidates. You'd have the crazy left-wingers who would never win, ever. You'd have the right-wingers who are just a bunch of miserable bastards and would also never win. And you'd have the plain centrist candidate who promises nothing and has the support of the party apparatus, and then they would just sort of trundle on to victory. This time, the election's actually interesting. So even while we started all of this sort of discussion with the debate being utterly boring, it's the election itself that's fascinating this time.
All right. Well, let's turn our focus over to the recent British Columbian provincial election. So we just kind of wanted to quickly recap on the recent surprise victory of the BC NDP with in conjunction with the BC Green Party.
Yeah,
it kind of looked like, at first when the election happened, it looked like the Liberals basically won it.
Sort of. They got a minority government, at least, right? They had gotten more. Did get more seats than the NDP got. However, as it turned out, we were waiting. What was it, for like a week and a half or 2 weeks or something for a single seat in the Upper Island to
Courtney Comox.
Yeah, Courtney Comox was like too close to call, and they had to do a recount, and it took fucking forever. And man, if there wasn't an election that took longer than the election actually took.
Well, it was like 2 months before the actual new government was formed.
And what's fascinating is because everyone was waiting on that vote, because if the Liberals had gotten it, they would have just barely gotten a majority government. One seat, and even then they would have had to figure out some way to appoint a speaker, and who knows.
Well, I'm still not sure who the current speaker of the new NDP government is, to be fair, but
I don't know. I don't understand this too much myself. I've heard plenty of people say that, you can appoint any one speaker, or it's the law that you have to appoint a sitting member of the legislature speaker, or it's just a matter of tradition. A lot of those stupid rules that everybody never thinks about are now in play because there's a minority government that is so razor thin.
Yeah, but this is like a 50-year precedent setting.
Even the last minority government wasn't this thin, but...
So, in any event, we have a new NDP government. We haven't had an NDP government in 16 years. This is the fourth time that the provincial BC NDP has ever formed government, and they are doing so on the basis of support of the Green Party, which is kind of a uneasy marriage between the two parties, because on the face of things, the BC NDP and the Green Party agree on almost everything, from if we're talking about environmental policy, if we're talking about just having a basic, more fair society. The BC NDP and the Greens are the progressive bloc. We make up 60-ish% of the voting base. But there are really big differences between the Greens and the NDP's policies and values, especially when it comes to labor rights. If we look at Andrew Weaver, for example, he represents Oak Bay. Oak Bay is... For those listeners that aren't familiar, it's quite an affluent area in the Greater Victoria area.
No one outside of Victoria will get this, but everybody refers to it as behind the tweed curtain.
Tartan curtain.
Tweed curtain.
Plaid
whatever.
curtain.
Yeah.
They're, the old school British.
You don't set your clock back an hour when you go to Oak Bay. You set it back 20 years. That kind of thing. It's a bulwark of conservative attitudes in the city. And yes, Andrew Weaver and others depended on those kinds of bulwarks on Vancouver Island to get the 3 seats that they actually did get. And that's important to keep in mind. The Green Party, while they did fairly well throughout the whole province, they still are constrained by their base of support in the lower Vancouver Island area. And even on Vancouver Island, a lot of those seats were pretty damn close and could potentially be an upset in the next election. Most of Vancouver Island is between... Southern Vancouver Island is between the Greens and the NDP now. The Liberals have sort of gone away. And that does, because the supporters of the Liberals haven't gone away. They're just now voting for the Green Party.
Well, it's interesting because most of the time, if you look at the whole sort of don't split the vote, left-wing contingency sort of attitude, they treat it as though that the Green Party is taking votes away from the NDP because they're both progressive parties and therefore they're interchangeable. But there's actually a lot of people that are Green liberals.
Oh, sure, right-wing Greener. I know plenty of people in the Green Party, and in fact, it's almost a stereotype in BC at this point, where like the average Green Party supporter is like a small business owner.
Yeah,
where they're pissed off. They don't like unions and they don't like corporations, and so that's their whole bag.
The Green Party is pretty much a petty bourgeois party.
Sure, if you're looking for a class basis for what their party really represents, it's that. Now, of course, that basis can change. They could become both more progressive or more regressive, I guess, in time. I think the problem with the Green Party I have now, and the Green Party in BC in particular, is how much they seem to want to ride that line. Their power comes from the fact that they can choose one side or the other. And it was no more better exemplified than in the last election, where Andrew Weaver's significance politically was greatly enhanced by the fact that he could decide who could form government. Andrew Weaver is never going to be premier, but he can be the kingmaker. He can choose who will be the premier. And it's that kind of choice that's often touted by Green Party supporters as their great virtue. They can pick the best choice of whatever it is. They're not constrained by ideological baggage like the NDP or the Liberals are. The NDP is always supporting organized labor, even though they aren't. And the Liberal Party is always supporting making jobs, even though they aren't. And the Green Party can present itself as just this reasonable party of reasonable people doing the right thing at the right time, and that's it. Unfortunately for them, I think that the Green Party is still constrained by the realities of capitalism, and at some point they're going to have to choose. And in this case, for at least for now, they chose the NDP. Or rather, Andrew Weaver and his two other MLAs chose the NDP. I saw a few polls while the revote was being done up island, Courtney Comox. A bunch of polls were being done of Green Party supporters that were suggesting that like 60% of them wanted Andrew Weaver to make a deal with the NDP. And I suspect, although I have absolutely no evidence for this, but I do suspect that period of time where he was reading those polls coming in was what eventually pushed him over the edge and forced him to support the NDP. I
don't think anyone would doubt that that Andrew Weaver and the Green Party would have considered entering into a coalition with the Liberals.
Well, they did have a meeting with Christy Clark, or Andrew Weaver had a meeting with Christy Clark. The world will never know what was said or what was promised or what was not promised in that meeting, but yes, he went to them, he asked them what they wanted, he asked them what they could give, and whatever the answer that he got from Liberals, it apparently wasn't good enough.
I think one of the major differences between the BC NDP and the Green Party is their policy on and their orientation towards organized labor. One of the main issues that the BC NDP brought up was the issue of changing the unionization rules to eliminate the secret ballot initiative, and
it just allowed for card counting.
So
basically, the way it works under the current rules is that the unions, if a place is trying to be unionized, a already established union usually goes in and starts signing up people for union cards. That happens over a period of time. And then after that, after they get a certain number of cards, ideally the union wants a majority because that's a prerequisite for a vote, essentially. They then go to a secret, quote-unquote secret ballot, which isn't really all that secret because everybody works there and the boss knows who's voting for who because they're the boss and they talk to everyone. But then, so you have the card count, you have the card sign-up, and then you have the vote. The NDP wants to get rid of the second vote. So the idea would be if a union can sign people up, if a union can sign up enough people onto union cards at a particular workplace, that workplace is now unionized, and that's it. That second vote essentially exists in order to be another hoop for unions to try to jump through.
Well, that just gives the bosses time to intimidate.
It just makes it harder. It's
workers.
Like there's a bunch of rules that exist. In principle, they exist for sober second thought and who knows. But really, these rules exist in order to frustrate attempts at organizing unions. That's it. That's why that second vote is there.
If we did have the policy that the NDP of British Columbia wants, that would be like the most progressive union forming legislation on the fucking continent.
Well, probably.
And I think that this really underscores the difference between the Green progressives and the NDP progressives, where on one hand you have just kind of these wishy-washy ideas about being more kind to the environment, but on the other hand you have we actually want the laws to be in place to make improving the lives of working people to be much easier and better and more robust. Whereas the Green Party kind of wants to do these like socially progressive, economically, environmentally progressive things, but don't actually want to come out in support of making working people's lives better in a basic sense.
Well, they have a very different attitude towards how the word progressive actually works. I'm putting words in their mouth, but I mean, that's just sort of the situation I'm in, I guess. I do think that what the Green Party is trying to do is they're trying to create a world that doesn't need unions or corporations. And that's just not fucking possible.
That is, no, it's not.
Like, this idea of like the small green business, the wind farm producer, the solar panel seller, all this kind of stuff is great and will actually exist. And I think the world is better for it. But if we're talking about sort of the fundamental framework of how our economy works, how it functions, corporations don't just exist in order to screw people over. They exist as a product of the nature of capitalism. And unions don't just exist in order to be bureaucratic and awful. They exist, and they keep existing, because workers are constantly trying to find a way of expressing their rights and fighting for their interests against capitalism. Unless capitalism is done away with, neither of those things are going to disappear. And I think the Green Party's desire or effort to try to do away with those things kind of just speaks to a kind of, I guess, just a delusional attitude towards the way capitalism works. I really don't think the Green Party has a coherent position, which, to be fair, as we mentioned before, with the Green Party having a left wing and a right wing that in many ways are irreconcilable, that might be the only way you can keep that party together. The minute you actually start going after concrete aspects of the system you're facing, the Green Party will probably break into pieces. You got the environmentalists who fucking hate business, hate capitalism, really radical granola types who would just be just as happy just living on a farm as in a city or whatever. And then you've got your small business owners who just think that technology and green industry is just the future.
We just need more common sense solutions.
The Green Party is just the way to do that. And common sense solutions, blah, 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 blah. And then you have people who just fucking hate the establishment parties, who just want a different party that isn't these bastards who have sold us out so many times before. And I think those different factions and those different interests in that party create sort of an irreconcilable forces that the kind of practical analysis of capitalism I'm proposing would probably destroy the Green Party. So I guess, having said all this, it's no surprise, I suppose, that Andrew Weaver chose the easy option and did what the majority of his membership wanted him to do, and put his vote behind the NDP.
And I guess that leads us to the question that, what is the NDP Green Provincial British Columbia Alliance actually going to do insofar as the sort of environmentalist persuasion that we have going on? I mean, we see the LNG program was canceled. It was because of the gas prices. But, we, in any event, we see the government sort of orientating themselves away from resource industries. Where are the new jobs going to come from? I mean, if we don't have the LNG plants being constructed, I read recently that because of the insane housing prices in Vancouver, Kelowna has become quite a tech startup with all sorts of new industries in the high-tech sector being founded there. Anyway, what I'm saying is, I mean, how is the BC government, who is opposed to environmental resource extraction and pro-environment, pro-labor, where are the new jobs going to come from?
Boy, that's a good question. There's two things I'd just like to say, just to be simple, I guess. I mean, that is in and of its. People could write books about that kind of question. Where are jobs going to come from in the future is not an easy question because of automation and dying industries and all that sort of stuff. I don't believe that automation is in and of itself actually the cause of job shortages, but whatever. When it comes to BC, where are new jobs going to come from? Ideally, they'll come from the industries that are going to be created or, in tertiary ways, created from new industries. As our economy develops in BC, if it develops, we will have new jobs. The classic example that I think every British Columbian can understand perfectly well is, if we ship raw logs out of the province, there are a small number of jobs involved in that. But if we mill them here, if we produce things out of those logs, out of that sawdust, out of the grain, we get many, many, many more times jobs. And of course, all the jobs that depend on those jobs, you can create an economy that is greater than it seems in the first instance. The problem I guess I have from the green economy and from a lot of people who have said, let's just stop the pipelines. I don't want fucking pipelines in my province. That's me.
Yeah,
I don't.
Me too. Fuck them.
I don't. But I am utterly skeptical, completely 100% skeptical of people who will just say, don't worry, the new jobs will be there. There will just be green jobs. There will be a green economy. That BC will be fine. Don't worry about it. We just shut the pipelines down and somehow things will be better. There will be jobs to take up the slack. And I think plenty of people have heard that when NAFTA was introduced, when any kind of trade agreement was introduced, when new labor laws were introduced. Yes, it's destroying this industry, but there will be new service sector industries that will be better.
And as it turns out, the service sector jobs have been really shitty.
Yeah, shitty. And now the service sector jobs look like they might evaporate as well in some cases. And so the question becomes, well, what is the new industry that's going to take up the bulk of people who are now going to be unemployed? I don't really know. And in the case of BC, that answer has still not been proposed by either the new BC government or, in some cases, the people running for leadership of the federal NDP. I think that in the case of Guy Caron, his UBI program is at least an answer to that problem. I think nationalization of industries and taking them under our control from Nikki Ashton is an answer to that problem. And, people are perfectly free to decide, which one they find more reasonable or plausible. So there are at least proposals in the works. But time and again, my problem with governments that have come into power and with people running for political parties has been that they just don't seem to care very much the specifics of how that will actually work. People are being put out of work, and it's just sort of, well, don't worry. You'll find something. You'll find something. That would be great. I don't really care. I don't have like a real interest in any particular kind of job. My only concern is that it pays well enough that you can have a family, you can have a life, you can live somewhere, you can have, live in a neighborhood, live in a community you can call your own. That's it. If you can do that, I don't care what the work is. The problem, of course, is that most of the work being created now does not fall under those, I would say, fairly generous guidelines. I hope that given the BC NDP's housing program, given their sincere desire to do away with the pipelines and to try to reorient the BC economy in a better way, I think there's a real potential there for jobs and for a better way of life. But they've been really scant on the details as of yet.
I'm not even convinced that there are details to present in this respect. I read a report earlier today that was saying that in the next 100 years or so, that human labor would be completely automated through and through. And so there would be no use for, we've automated ourselves out of our own jobs. And in a capitalist context, this is dystopian and awful. Mm-hmm. But if we actually had, a socialist economy that worked for people, then this would be great.
Oh,
we wouldn't have to work anymore. We could just go to the beach all day. I don't want anyone
working crap jobs.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, even grocery store clerks. Yeah. We have the automated fucking things available, and that's great because it saves people from having to do shitty menial work. But on the other hand,
if there's no one,
there's a bunch of people.
Options, right?
There's a bunch of people that are no longer going to get that paycheck doing that shitty menial work. So we have a conflict here between automation under capitalism, which just makes people unemployed. If we had a socialist economy, this could actually work to the benefit of everybody. If there's less work to be done all around, then that just means a shorter workday. So I think that as automation of our economies continue, this is going to press the question of, like, well, what is automation for? Is automation just there to benefit the capitalists, the business owners, to make their labor costs less? Mm-hmm. Or is automation there to make the workload on our entire society less so we can all have more spare time? As it stands now, it basically just renders people unemployed and short of a paycheck, and doesn't really benefit anybody except the people that that are business owners, you know. So I mean, on principle, I'm completely in favor of automation and making less work, less menial jobs, less shitty jobs for people, but we don't really have a economic system in place that makes those technological advancements benefit people as a whole, and that needs to happen.
I agree with you, particularly when it comes to differentiating between what you want and what actually is. I mean, I do want further automation, but I am happy and willing to recognize that, you know, barring that actually occurring, barring people's lives actually improving, what else can most people do but just try to cling on to what they have, cling on to the level of productivity, level of industry that's there, and just say, you know, fuck automation. It's just going to ruin my life and the lives of people around me. I get that. But that is, I guess, ultimately what we're sort of moving into now is sort of what bridges both the BC NDP's new government and this the federal NDP's new election, new leader will both have to grapple with this issue. This is sort of the merging problem, and probably the bigger problem that has yet to be really addressed by anyone in either this leadership race or in the election. And I think there's a lot of work to do on that point. There's a lot of work to do when it comes to a lot of social democratic positions. But I guess when it comes to jobs, the ugliest four-letter word we have in the English language is jobs. And you either have them or you don't. And if we don't, there's a real big problem. And that's all there is to it. And I think that we need to grapple with that on its own terms, in a very serious way, because we can't just say, don't worry, everybody, we'll figure it out, you know? And that's been, for the most part, what Social Democrats and NDPers have been saying for quite some time.